Hey guys, welcome back to Unit 11, the North and the South. Last time we met, we talked about the slave laws that basically kept slavery in play in the United States of America since the Constitution was created and up to the American Civil War. All right. This video is going to be over the South and the institution of slavery. So you will need your note packet out, your North and South note packet. Today we're basically going to go over pages 6 and 7, just those two pages there. Before we get going on the South, I want to recap the history of cash crops in the South. From 1700 to 1790, the southern cash crops consisted of mainly tobacco, rice, and indigo. And if we remember back in the Jamestown era, tobacco was a huge export and really was responsible for making the colonies flourish at first. And really, in this early time, cotton here was just way too much, took too much time and too much labor. It was very labor intensive. In order for cotton's fibers to be used, you had to first take out the seeds out of the cotton boll. What I have here is a piece of a cotton plant, and here I have a cotton boll. The boll being this hard shell here that begins closed up, and as it matures and dries out, the pod pops open, and then it exposes this cottonous fiber here. So what the slaves would need to do out in the field was they would come along and pick the cotton out of the boll. Okay? Now, if you take a closer look, maybe I'll try to get in a little bit closer. The bolls here, as they pop out, you can tell there are sharp edges here on these bolls. And of course, someone new to picking cotton would obviously, after thousands and thousands of plants every day of doing this, they're going to puncture their hands, have bloody hands when they start doing that, until their hands could toughen up to the conditions or the sharp edges of the cotton boll. So that's what's left when the cotton is picked out. All right, but like I said, before cotton fibers can be used, you've got to get the seeds out of them. And you know, that's easier said than done. So if I have a wad of cotton here, I have to kind of feel through here, and I got to find seeds, and then I gotta pick it out. Of course, I want to try to keep as much cotton as possible. So here's an example of a cotton seed. All right, that's just one. I don't know if you guys are timing me at home, but I'm only up to one. So let's say I go for another one. Here, it's coming along there. All right, hey, we got two seeds now. Oh, let's go for a third here. Yeah, working on this. Oh, this one's in tight. All right, so here we go. And I got my third seed out of this cotton. Now, just feeling around, I would probably guesstimate, let's see, there's about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. It could be on up to 25 seeds in just one of those cotton bolls. So you saw how long it took me just to get 3 out. Imagine 25 seeds that you would have to pull out a wad of cotton just like this. So very, very time consuming and very labor intensive. So up until 1790, it wasn't really a feasible economic cash crop, and so they relied mostly on the tobacco, the rice, and the indigo. All right, but that's all going to change with the invention of the cotton gin. In 1793, a gentleman by the name of Eli Whitney created, I wouldn't say create, he didn't create the cotton gin, but rather he adapted a design of the cotton gin. It was the Pakistanis who actually invented the design of the cotton gin to separate seeds from cotton fibers. But however, the cotton grown in America was much thicker and tougher cotton fibers. So Eli Whitney, knowing that the Pakistani cotton gin model wouldn't work with American cotton, he's going to make some adaptations to it and make it so that it could easily process the American cotton in the cleaning process. So, you know, this was a big time invention. And with inventions like our smartphones or iPads and whatever have you, technology is supposed to make our life easier. It's supposed to make life better. And what Eli thought he was doing was making cotton cleaning easier, so that perhaps maybe slaves would not be needed to harvest and clean the cotton. But what we're going to find out here in this lecture is it's going to have the exact opposite effect. It's actually going to make slavery boom after his invention in 1793. Right here we just have a sketch of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Obviously it's going to be hand cranked. There is no electricity during this time. I hope you know that. So it's going to be man-made power with a crank and some belts and whatnot. So here's how it basically works. Generally you just have a box here. So the cotton bolls with the seeds will come into the chamber like so. And then there's this cylinder that you'll turn with a crank. And on this cylinder there are little teeth that will actually comb through the cotton fibers and dispense the seeds in this chamber right here. And then the cotton fibers continue on in the process and cleaned out further with smaller brushes. And then hopefully at the end in this container or at the end of the chamber, you have clean cotton with all the seeds back here. Pretty simple design, but effective and made cotton cleaning a lot more effective and more efficient. So the impact of this invention. Before this invention, one person could clean 1 pound of cotton a day. Now after this invention, one person could then clean 50 pounds. So it multiplied, I'm trying to find my little whiteboard here, it multiplied the efficiency by 50 times. So if you take a look again, the impact of the cotton gin, before one person does 1 pound of cotton, but after it explodes, one person can clean 50 pounds of cotton. So, you know, obviously you're going to get a lot more production out of cotton harvest. Right, here I just have a map of the slave concentration by population in the United States of America. The red being really high concentration with pink being smaller concentration. And a misconception that a lot of people have is that slavery did not exist at all in any form in the North. But this map is actually going to refute that myth, because there are little pockets of pink in the North here. And as a matter of fact, you see Massachusetts where you know, the abolitionist movement really kind of kicked up alongside with Pennsylvania and the Quakers and the abolitionist movement. There's still slavery in several counties up here in the North. And let's take a look at Indiana. I would say Indiana, though, probably could go on record as being the most friendly state as far as slave owning goes. Here we only have about 3 counties here in pink. So the cotton gin changes everything in the South. The ways that the cotton gin is going to change the South is that it's going to trigger more cotton production in the West. And in effect, it's going to increase the demand for slaves. And I have a little flow chart right here on the effect of the cotton gin. All right, so because of the cotton gin, you can harvest more cotton. Well, if you can harvest more, well, then we're going to need more land. And more land is going to lead to, well, you can grow more crops and more cotton plants. And with more cotton plants, you're going to need even more slaves to keep up with the demand of all that cotton that needs to be picked for the 50 pounds of cotton that's going to go into the cotton gin. So again, the cotton gin has a reverse effect on slavery. It was supposed to help slaves and eventually just make it so there was no need for slaves, but it actually makes slavery explode here. And number two, it's going to make cotton the king crop of the South. Before, I said that rice, indigo, and tobacco were cash crops. Now here, cotton's going to take over in a major way. Another whiteboard demonstration is, if we take a look at the U.S. exports, now this is going to be North and South combined, everything that they ship out. If you take a look at 1800, cotton is going to make up 7% of all U.S. exports. And just 60 years later, in 1860, take a look at this pie chart right here. 58% of all U.S. exports is going to be cotton. So the United States of America is really heavily dependent on cotton production. And because they're dependent on cotton, they're dependent on slavery. So you can see here that being 58% cotton is in all U.S. exports, cotton is going to be king. It is going to run and rule the economy, especially in the South. Now, ironically enough, in the North, you have many factories, looms that are taking this cotton and weaving it to make fabric. So they too, in a way, are heavily dependent on cotton and the increased production of cotton in the South. All right, and the third effect that I'd kind of like to throw in here was that because cotton was so profitable and now easier to harvest, the South spent little time creating industry because cotton gin or cotton farming was making so much money, and the money was all wrapped up into land and into the slaves that the Southerners just had really no need to or had no will to build factories, much like they did during this early 1800 period in the North, where the Industrial Revolution has taken place. The South, however, not so much. Okay. Again, as I mentioned before, South is going to have little industry. One of the reasons is they're just going to lack capital, lack the money to build these factories. And cotton was making so much money for the farmers anyway. Why fix something that wasn't broken, in their words? And number three, limited local markets. Sure, they could build the factories, and if they build the factories and produce goods, most people in the South were small-time poor farmers. The plantation owners in the South really made up a pretty small percentage of the population in the South. So I say limited local markets because there's not a lot of rich people in the South to buy the goods that would come out of this factory. So transportation in the South when compared to the North is going to be a lot different. The South is going to rely on natural waterways. They're going to rely basically on small river networks. Now in the North, they got the Great Lakes, they got canals, and so they have a lot more opportunity for trading and shipping. And we also know from our earlier studies that New England was the center of colonial trade. So unlike the North, the South has few canals. Their roads are really poor when compared to the North, and the rail lines or the railroads in the South really are not well developed like they are in the North. You've got many railroads in the North connecting Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati to New York, just all over the place, all the major cities in the North. In the South, you only had short networks of railroads connecting just some of the few major cities in the South. I have a pie chart here to show or demonstrate the difference between the North and the South in all total U.S. railroads. As you can tell here, the North is going to possess 2/3 of all railroads in the United States, and the South is going to have 1/3. Now, just thinking ahead to the Civil War, could you think of a way that this might impact either side in the Civil War, with the North having more railroads, the South having less? It could come into huge play here in the American Civil War. Slavery is going to continue to be a major source of labor, and more slaves are needed, as I had showed you that flow chart before. And most of the slaves in the South were on huge plantations, not on the small farmers or the yeoman lands. Very few whites in the South were plantation owners, but those that were had enormous amount of lands, and this is where you're going to find most of the slaves. So a majority of the slaves were owned by a very small group of plantation owners in the South. Let's take a look at the dichotomy of the Southern population. First observation we can make is that a small percent of whites actually own slaves, despite what many people might believe. As a matter of fact, if we take a look here on this chart, it may be a little hard to see on camera here, but I'll kind of explain it. In purple, it represents the non-slaveholders, white non-slaveholders, and that is about 50%. So 50% of whites, or 50% of the population in the South were whites who did not own slaves. Number two, the majority of Southern whites were yeomen, or small, poor farmers. And if we take a look at this chart here, as far as whites goes, what's in red are slave holders. So these are going to be the plantation owners. They only make up 17% of the Southern population. 17%. So not even a fifth of the population in the South is going to be slave owning. And if you take a look at African Americans, the blue are African Americans who are actually enslaved in the South, and they're going to make up 32% of the population in the South. And then you have a small sliver here in yellow making up 2% of the Southern population. This represents the few free African Americans in the South who owned their own lands and in fact had African American slaves themselves. Again, it was rare, but it did in fact happen. So to deal with the cruelty and the drudgery of slavery, African Americans used religion, friendship, and music to endure the cruel conditions of slavery. One very famous spiritual is Come Low, Sweet Chariot. I will try to find something on YouTube and connect it to the webpage so you can listen to it. I'm sure a lot of you have heard it, but it's still just beautiful music. Again, these type of songs are called spirituals. They're going to be religious folk songs. And like I mentioned before, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And sometimes slaves would actually sing in code so that they could communicate with other slaves in the fields. So unbeknownst to the slave owners, the slaves were actually talking and communicating and planning back and forth through their music. Families were very important to slaves, and often families would be broken up at slave auctions, and they were divided, split up. husband and wife torn apart, kids taken away from their mothers. So when, say, a young slave would be sold into slavery to another plantation away from their parents, they would basically adopt an older slave to become like a father figure or uncle figure, mother, aunt figure, and this was kinship. So they were as close as family without being family, and the slaves depended heavily on this to survive. Now, slave codes. Obviously, it's horrible, cruel conditions in slavery, and in order to keep people suppressed, there obviously has to be certain guidelines that the Southern whites are going to have to push on the slaves in order to keep them in line. And so let's take a look at the slave codes. These weren't exactly published and voted upon laws, but rather they were unspoken rules of how to govern slaves or how to keep them oppressed. 3 things that slaves could not do: they could not own property, they did not have legal rights, so trying to sue someone for your freedom was, well, can't be done. Number 3, it was wrong to strike a white person even though the white person may have provoked the attack in the first place. Now, let's take a look at some other slave codes that we have here. It was forbidden to leave the plantation. 5th, it was forbidden to have many slaves assemble in one area in fear that they might be planning a rebellion or a revolt against the slave owners. So here's a right that we take very seriously, our First Amendment right, the right to assemble in our Bill of Rights, but this was not afforded to the slaves during this time period. It was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. Now, why is that? Why do you want to keep human beings ignorant? Why not teach them how to read or write? Well, if you could read or write, you can think. Thinking leads to organization of thought, and organization might lead to a plan, and a plan might lead to a plot, and a plot could lead to a rebellion. So when you have oppressors, their number one priority is to keep the people ignorant. Remember that. It's an important lesson. You want to be educated. You don't want to be ignorant, because under ignorance you can be oppressed. And the last one, slaves could not marry. However, the slaves did have marriage ceremonies called jumping the broom. Some slave owners allowed that to happen, and even took part in these jumping the broom ceremonies, but some slave owners did not allow it whatsoever, because the man and the woman was property of the slave owner. Now, what are some punishments if these slave codes are violated? You could be whipped, and here's a very, very famous picture of a slave that obviously was not very obedient and had taken many lashes to the back, and this guy has scars upon scars on top of scars from being whipped so much. Number two, they could be branded if a particular slave was being difficult or disobedient. They might be branded. A hot iron put into the fire and burned onto the skin to signify, hey, you want to keep your eyes on this slave. And fourthly, depending on the offense, slaves could be killed. Slave owners obviously don't want to kill off their property, but if the offense called for it, they could murder a slave, and it would be perfectly legal in the South here under these slave codes. Now, these slave codes made for horrible conditions for the slaves, And many were rebellious against these slave codes. And one particular gentleman was Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave who was looked up to by other slaves. He was kind of the religious figure for the slaves around him. And he had the belief that God wanted him, picked him, chose him to free the slaves in any way possible. Any way possible. Well, you know where that leads. Nat Turner and his rebellion. Turner is going to organize a slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1831. The rebellion ultimately fails, but in the process, Turner and his men had killed 55 white men, women, and children. And because of this rebellion, this made Southern slave owners even more fearful to the results. So they knew that they had to crack down to send a message for any other slave who might get the thought of revolting against the slave owners. And so they non-discriminately went and killed 200 slaves in revenge, sometimes putting their head on post just to serve as notice or warning. Hey, don't get any funny ideas because look what might happen. I have a quote from Nat Turner that I think would sum up what he thought was his mission. And the quote goes like this: "At about this time I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and I saw black spirits engaged in a battle, and the sun was darkened. The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. And I heard a voice saying," perhaps it's from God, "Let it come, rough or smooth, you must surely bear it." So Nat Turner, you could tell, had the idea in his head and the will and the motivation that no matter how ugly it turned out, he was going to follow through on his plan. All right, so that finishes up the South and slavery, and our next lecture for this chapter 13 is going to be over the North and their industrial revolution that they had up there. See ya.